Yeah, I'll start. I mean, my first question really is the brief characterization I gave of a Green New Deal just
Mhm.
now. Is that roughly correct? And if so, could you give a bit of a characterization of where the Green New Deal's come from and of some of the
Yeah.
proposals that have been put forward?
Okay. But yes, the characterization is right. I mean, the phrase Green New Deal, I think if you go back far enough, I mean, this is Aditya Chakrabarty's claim in The Guardian last year. It was Thomas Friedman, who is otherwise best known as a sort of very pro-free market Iraq war supporter at the start of the 2000s, a prominent New York Times columnist. Otherwise, somebody who didn't necessarily, it wouldn't strike you as someone who's particularly keen on government action, but basically got the kind of environmental bug at some point in the mid 2000s and started talking about Green New Deal. Briefly, Gordon Brown raised the idea in about 2009 when he suggested that Britain could create what at the time was derided as too ambitious, 100,000 green jobs by 2030 or something. Here we go. I think I might get a video now. There we are. Hi everyone. Like the New Deal of the 1930s that Stephen was just talking about, and all of these programs. The idea and the phrase was then taken up by some of the people I used to work with at the New Economics Foundation, people like Anne Pettifor, and a few others sort of ran with it. Although it got a new lease of life sometime after that, and just giving you sort of the history of the term with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who sort of picked up the idea and really ran with it and added a few bells and whistles into the mix. So it's got this sort of transatlantic existence originally, transatlantic and English speaking existence. The New Deal was an American idea. It's been something that various people in America have picked up on as a way of describing what a good, effective government intervention might look like. That if you want in America to talk about not government is bad, government must get out of the way, but government can actually make a difference, the really good reference point, it's one that people recognize, commonly, is to talk about the New Deal. If you take it over here, I think it's got more of a resonance with people who are aware of that history in America, more so, I suspect, than like most people out there in the wider world. Although I think that's started to change just because the phrase gets used so much that people have an idea what it might be about by this point, but it's not got quite the same history built into it. And what all of the proposals for a Green New Deal tend to center on is really at the core of most of them anyway, is kind of two things. One is a recognition of the urgent need to decarbonize the economies that we live in. So in other words, to take the economic processes that we have, which includes basically everything, how we live, how we travel to work, the kind of works we do, the kind of goods we consume, how they're produced, where we make them, to take all of that and reduce as rapidly as possible the amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with every stage of that. So you say things like, okay, where we live, you want to insulate our houses properly because that's going to reduce the amount of heating that you need, and that means you're going to reduce the amount of fossil fuel that you burn, and that means you reduce the amount of carbon that you're producing there. If you're talking about how we produce, I mean, versions of the Green New Deal would include things like, well, we need to very rapidly shift into electric vehicle manufacture. This has been part of some of the US proposals. More radically, in some ways, you might say, okay, we want to shift into not just electric vehicles, but we want everyone to use more public transport, and we want that transport to be electricity driven. So it's not diesel in your buses. You have green buses, you have clean buses, you have electrically powered buses instead. So that's the sort of production part of it, or the travel part of it. If you get really into the production part of it, you're potentially into more advanced versions of this, and sometimes a reliance on new technologies, which again has certainly been part of the US proposals, but has come up less often, I think, in some of the ones that are doing the rounds in Britain, which is invest very heavily in research and development, and will use this very focused research to deliver new technologies that will allow us to decarbonize very rapidly. Now, all of these different versions of the Green New Deal tend to center on a kind of combination of three things. It's the third thing I haven't particularly talked about yet. One, that we need to rapidly decarbonize. Two, that we can do this by changing basically the technologies that we use and in different parts of our lives. I mean, you change the technology in your house, you insulate it better. You change the technology of how you make your houses, you can make them much more efficient in the building and construction. And you can see, when you build a modern house now, you can build it far more efficiently and therefore less carbon intensively than a house, even 10 years ago. The modern production techniques allow you to do this. And that the third part, as well as changing the technology, the bit that's missing in all of this is that you have to get government to do this. That every single step of the way, instead of saying, okay, we will allow a market to put a price on carbon or a price on polluting the atmosphere, and because of the market signals that will then be sent, everybody will change their behavior and adapt towards this new low carbon future. So all versions of the Green New Deal have this idea that government can intervene and change what's going to happen. That's probably the defining feature of it. The various sort of actual proposals have varied at different points, that people have put things in, taken things out, depends on which country you sit in. In the English-speaking world, it's tended to look very much along the lines that I've described, but always it's with the idea that government intervention is necessary to make this happen, that if we want to decarbonise at the pace required, that our climate modelling tells us we need, you have to get government to do it. It's no good just saying the market will deliver. You have to get something else there to sort of push the process along.
Okay, thank you. We still can't see your video, James. Could you look at?
Really?
I think you have to.
It's very strange because it's listed as it's working, and it's let me. I'll try and turn. It's showing me that it's displaying. I can see myself, which is always delightful. But hang on. Let's see if I start and stop it. It might change that. How's that?
Oh yes, that's better.
Okay.
Thank
all
you.
right. There we go. Fine. Well, sorry about that, but there we are. Hopefully you heard me okay.
Yes, people have to wait a little bit on the video afterwards it'll be a suspense thing for people. They'll wait until they'll get your face in the end. Okay, so earlier when we were discussing this by text, and you said to me that although you would defend this Green New Deal program as very necessary, and you would defend it against people who would say that we can't have this, we can't afford it. You had some reservations, or you thought that it probably wasn't enough. What do you think is missing in existing Green New Deal programs that you would like to add?
There's a couple of things, and again, I think it's changed because people pushing and arguing for. If you look at what the Green New Deal groups in Britain are arguing for, there's a real recognition around a lot of these issues. The first bit, I suppose, is that of course we do need to decarbonise, right? This is something that we should be doing. We should be doing faster than is happening, because actually our climate models are pretty good by now, and there's a very clearly established relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and a steady warming of the Earth's average temperatures, with all the consequences that follow out of this: increased extreme weather events, reduced crop growth in some parts of the world, at least, increased desertification, biodiversity loss, all that sort of thing. So all of that needs to happen. The trouble is, it's only kind of one dimension of the total amount of basically damage that we're doing to the world, to the natural environment that we inhabit. I mean, biodiversity loss is an obvious part of this. This is quite phenomenal, the amount of species that are being driven to extinction now, essentially from our activities, that we're living through effectively the 6th mass extinction event that we know of in the planet's history. The rate of die-off is so great. And that has, I mean, you can say, I think it's quite reasonable to say that's bad in itself, that it's just bad to have this loss, permanent and forever loss of some creatures or some plant life out there. You can attribute an inherent value to it. It also starts to have these peculiar knock-on effects that once you chew a long way into the ecosystems that we actually rely on for our wider activities, then potentially the biodiversity loss actually has lots of other knock-on impacts elsewhere, and all sorts of things that we do. And you can see all sorts of different versions of this. I mean, the one that people have really started, I think, correctly picking up on is the loss of insect life and its relationship to pollination, and therefore to crop growth, and bees in particular is the one that people have picked up on. And that's something that materially affects us. Whatever we, even if you say we don't care if the animals die, then it still matters. It's still going to change how our society functions if you do this. So there's a need to start to think, I think, a bit more seriously about biodiversity loss and build that into what we're doing. The other part of this, and this is perhaps a broader criticism of Green New Deal type proposals, is that, look, if you say let's decarbonise, all right, fine, we do actually have the technology to do this really quite quickly if we wanted to. If there's a big enough push to do it, you can, in principle, do this quite rapidly in transport. Right? You can swap every car on the streets in Britain for an electric vehicle, if you're so minded to do this. It'd be expensive, but at least in principle, that's something that can happen. The technology's there for us to be able to do that. The difficulty is that Doing that creates this huge resource use somewhere else. So there's a huge demand if you try and switch into electric vehicles very rapidly on a very wide scale for instance, the rare earth minerals that go into the batteries that all of these cars or buses or whatever will need. And those rare earths, lithium and all the rest have to come from somewhere. So if you're pushing very hard for decarbonisation of transport system, everybody's now going to have an electric car. That's a huge demand for batteries. That's a huge demand for the materials in batteries. That means somebody somewhere is digging those materials up. So you're having, underpaid miners in Bolivia or somewhere in South America, or you start to open up new parts of the world to exploitation. The fuss, people might remember when Trump was talking about buying Greenland a couple of years ago when he was president of the US. That's like, on one level, it's just the kind of mad stuff that you come out with. On the other hand, there's a thought here that Greenland is reckoned to have one of the world's largest untapped rare earth resources anywhere on the planet. So suddenly everyone is trying to pile into Greenland to exploit that. Now, their new government, elected there last year, has actually got quite a firm line on not allowing mining to take place. They don't think that this push to decarbonisation should mean the complete despoliation of one of the few sort of unspoiled wildernesses left on the planet, right? There's a cost here. There's difficulties in saying, let's just decarbonise rapidly. And I think there's sometimes a tendency in versions of Green New Deal to say, okay, we'll just push hard because we've got the technology, we can make this happen quickly. But what about all the consequences behind it, particularly where those consequences are, okay, everybody in comparatively well off, global North Britain gets an electric car. What does that mean for whoever's having to dig it somewhere else in the global south? So there's this broader, I think, conception of what an effective ecological program would look like that's needed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think probably most people I know in the chat would probably agree with you on that focus. But can we bring it back to the kind of basics of the Green New Deal and the kind of government spending program that's necessary? So why is this program necessary? Why isn't leaving the climate emergency to the market going to work? And why hasn't it been working? There've been market-oriented approaches in the past, and emissions have kept on going up through that whole history. So why hasn't that worked?
I mean, there's two sets of major problems in saying let's have a market do this. I mean, the first one, I think, and this is where we're going to have to be quite careful, particularly in Britain. You can see Boris Johnson doing a version of this. Now, Liz Truss in some ways might have made our lives a bit easier politically because she's sort of backing away. I mean, she just doesn't seem to get these issues at all. Notionally still committed, and she said she was committed to net zero by 2050, which is far too late, by the way. But not really someone who's greatly enamored by green issues. The reason Boris Johnson was doing this, I think, first of all, it's like these things are popular, and this was a man who cared about popularity. I mean, they just are. You can go out and look at the opinion polls, talk to people. People get the idea that something can be done in this. But the other bit is that there's a version of decarbonisation in Britain especially, where you can say, actually, the market, left to mostly its own devices, is starting to deliver some of this, right? That we have actually seen with governments from 2010 onwards that were really, I mean, David Cameron's government was particularly useless on this. They cut subsidies for renewable energy production. They basically banned onshore wind farms, being opened anywhere in England. It's a different story in other parts of the United Kingdom. They're really just terrible. They're cutting the green crap, as David Cameron said in about 2014 or so. That's what they wanted to do. Despite that, just with market incentives, just with the fact that the technology for wind power in particular is now so cheap. I mean, it's the cheapest kind of electricity you can get. And the price differential between running a wind farm and what it costs to generate that electricity and how much you can actually charge people if you're a privatized producer. We've seen the sky high profits that they've been making at the minute. That's a real market incentive. So you do get some decarbonisation. Like Johnson would talk about how Britain has decarbonised, and it actually has decarbonised over the last 10 years. You see some of the things happening a bit in America. There's been some of this as well. So there is a kind of market version of this. There is a version of this where actually the price signals that are sent, the changes in technology, the fact that you have a market for like the technologies that people are implementing, for instance, to generate electricity, you can set it up and that will kind of work. The problem you've got is that this will be nothing like fast enough. Like if you say, okay, eventually probably under its own steam, frankly, I think you probably could decarbonize Britain by 2050 without government having to do very much. But 2050 is ludicrously slow. Like this is sort of sailing beyond what we understand of reasonable efforts to restrain the amount of greenhouse gas being pumped into the atmosphere. Market signals alone will not get you there fast enough. You have to have something that's going to push it along. That's one part of it. I think the other bit is taking a kind of broader definition of what a Green New Deal might be. That look, if you want to decarbonize, then yeah, okay, new technology, renewables, that's really a major part of it. We know this. But there's also some things that are going to have to step outside of that. Like to insulate everybody's house in the country is expensive and labor intensive. It's also really, really good for your energy bills. Like it just costs you a lot less to heat your house. It's quite a big win for Britain. It's a really big win for Britain because we have chronically energy inefficient houses compared to basically the rest of all of Europe. But if you want to do it yourself, it's going to be expensive. And that's why people don't do it, right? And it's expensive. It's a nuisance. You have to have people climbing around in your loft and all this sort of thing. So a government subsidy can make this happen really quickly in a way that, you know, if you basically say to people, we will pay to have someone put this in your house, that is a push through that restrictions that a market approach only would impose on you. The other bit is that, look, if we're serious about decarbonisation, we have to move beyond just saying, let's do the technology, let's get the technology right. There's also like, how do we live our lives? And that doesn't mean you always have to be, you always feel like you turn into a bit of a hippie or something at this point. It doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we'll have to put a hair shirt and everything's going to be terrible. I don't think that's the point at all. There's a load of things we can do that everybody would quite like to see happen that would actually be quite good for the planet. Like, for instance, a shorter working week. Like we know that if you have, for instance, fewer people traveling to work, that's an immediate saving on greenhouse gas emissions because you're using less transport. That's not something that the market by itself is going to deliver. No, we know this because it hasn't really happened. Now, interestingly, there are bits and pieces of firms starting to implement 4-day weeks, and that will probably add up to some advantages. But if you want the whole of society to move like this, you're going to need a push of some sort. You're going to need an incentive or a law or some change in how government behaves to get that to happen. So again, it's like taking that broader view. You're going to have some sort of public authority saying something about shaping this if we want to move quickly and we want to do it in a way that's if you like, the most efficient way to decarbonize, which is not just technology, it's also changing how we work and how we live.
Yeah, I mean, is there an essential advantage to public goods in this respect? I mean, you know, my study's full of books which I've had to buy because there's no decent library locally. You know, there's probably another guy on the side of Stratford who's got the same books as me, but you know, if there was a library, we can share the book. And you know, same with you know, vehicles. I suppose you have self-driving vehicles and everyone has one, then it's very bad. But if there's a few of them and they're going around and you know, doing a tour and you know, they're shared essentially between people, then you can have less cars on the road.
That's exactly it. I mean, there's this sort of, I mean, that's getting to the sort of economic theory version of this, where it's like basically, and most economists will tell you this, you all know the story, that a market economy, a market in general, is bad at delivering things that everyone's going to benefit from. Because the whole point of having a market is that you yourself are going to pay money and get this thing to consume yourself. And if everybody's going to benefit from you consuming it, or whoever's producing it can't claim all the profit from selling it themselves, if in other words, there's lots of advantages to everybody from this thing being produced, a market is not going to supply it as efficiently, as effectively as, you know, just government provision in the case of libraries. Like a library is a good thing to have. It's a good example to use. It's a good thing to have. It's clearly a public good. You can imagine a world, and there are some private libraries out there where you pay a fee and you can join and take books out and that sort of thing. But actually, markets are going to be undersupplied if you try and rely on a free market to do this, because there are many, many more people who'd like to go to the library but won't necessarily pay a fee, but would be able to take part in one if it was provided at scale by government. So there's lots and lots of versions of this. I mean, the environment itself tends to be treated as what economists call externalities. That if you have a non-polluted environment, but it costs money for companies to stop polluting, they're not likely to do that unless you tell them to, or tax them, or change how they behave, force them to do something different. They won't necessarily think about what's happening to the environment because they're focused on them making profit and what the market's telling them and what the price signal's telling them. Personally, I think you also actually think a bit broader than this, that we need a much more holistic view of economics, which is not that, you know, we're all in this economy and here's the environment external to us. It's we're all in an environment and here's the economy we've built on top of it. right? And that we have to sort of turn this round and take the view that we depend on the environment, not we are here to try and not damage the environment, if you see what I mean. That we need all of these processes, these big biological systems that surround us. We need them to carry on functioning if we want to carry on living sort of reasonable, happy lives. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to when you start contemplating what extreme weather, increasing extreme weather events or increasing numbers of virus outbreaks or pandemics in the future looks like. We have to take a more holistic view of the impacts we're having on the environment.
Thanks. So one of the big features of a Green New Deal is not just to pay for things like insulation and electric vehicles and so on, but actually to close down an industry, to close down the fossil fuel industry, especially perhaps to intervene with some other industries as well, like animal agriculture or the cement industry. But the big fossil fuel companies like to talk a good game. They have their decarbonisation plans, which are deemed grossly insufficient by Oil Change International. They've also known about the climate emergency for decades and spread misinformation and lobbied against climate action regardless. Why are they inherently untrustworthy? Why is it that we can't expect the big fossil fuel companies to voluntarily decarbonize?
It's that thing where they do kind of recognize that they're going to have to do something, but doing something for them is a long way into the future, and they recognize this largely because they've picked up on the sense that governments around the world probably aren't going to let them one way or the other carry on just polluting. But their version of this happening when Shell has to actually become not an oil company, when BP, as it was marketing itself, and possibly still does, market itself as beyond petroleum. I mean, ludicrous. It's not how BP makes its money. It's not beyond petroleum at all. They do sort of identify this, and it is somewhat more than just greenwashing. Right? They do have that, but it's a question of pace. It's like they aren't going to do this fast enough for a whole set of reasons. One, change is costly and difficult. If you've got one way of working already, and actually it is making you money, and right now it's making them extraordinary sums of money. If you look what's happened to the international price of, come down a bit in recent months, but still very, very high international prices of natural gas in particular. So you're making huge sums of money out of this, and it's costly to do something else. It's costly and it's not what you've done, so you just don't do it. It's just hard you to present that. The other bit is that if you then have companies that are valued by people buying and trading shares in those companies, particularly for fossil fuel companies, on the basis of the reserves they can claim, then your incentive is to make those reserves big, because then your company's worth more. So there's an incentive for you to go out and explore more and find more oil and gas and go to places, Siberia, the Arctic, the various new licenses in the North Sea, west of Shetland, that the government want to open up. There's a real incentive for you to do that, because the stock market is telling you what makes your company valuable. If you're a fossil fuel company, are your reserves. More reserves you have, more valuable those reserves are, the more your company's worth. This is just a big incentive for you to work that way. So put these things together, then they're not going to want to do this by themselves, right? The market incentives that are there, the costs and difficulties, the fact they're making profits right now from doing this means they won't change. The fact their valuations depend on already having all those reserves that they can look at and say, people who want to buy shares in them look at and say, this is how much you're worth, and what you claim about your reserves is your fundamental valuation as a fossil fuel company, because you're sitting on a big market, it's being traded. That's also a major part of put these two things together as a really tight lock on saying a fossil fuel company is ever really incentivized to change. You're going to have to push them in some form. You're going to have to try and force them to do something different. Ultimately, this means probably doing something like these companies will not exist. I mean, in the future, maybe BP could suddenly rapidly reinvent itself as something else. Now, there's a whole other question about whether you really want giant multinationals controlling major parts of our energy infrastructure, even if they're completely zero carbon. But it's just not really going to happen, right? There are none of the incentives there for them to do this.
Yeah, okay. So I think, the fossil fuel reserves of the entire planet, everything that's been discovered is on the balance sheet of one of these companies.
Yeah.
Is that right? And if those reserves were burned, then it would cook us to a crisp, basically. It would exceed our targets, our IPCC targets many times over. So the fact that these reserves are on their balance sheets, does that mean they have a kind of legal duty to exploit those? Is that?
Well, this is part of the, yes, basically that I mean, it depends on the details will depend on where your company is based, right? But if it's one of the big, basically publicly traded, in other words, it's listed on a stock exchange, oil companies or fossil fuel companies, they will have something in law that basically says you have a fiduciary duty. In other words, you have a legal obligation to try and maximize the value of this company in terms of its shares, in terms of its shareholders. And the people who own shares in them, they're not doing this for for some kind of hobby or something that's fun. I mean, mostly shares now are owned and controlled or managed at least by some of the really big asset managers. So huge companies like BlackRock is probably the most famous one. George Osborne went off to work for them. They control trillions, literally, of dollars worth of shares in many, many companies all over the world. And their incentive is always basically to maximize profits. Now, again, there's a lot of talk about recognizing these sort of long-term problems that we're running into of changing how companies behave, but it's a question of pace. And once you have a system that's just what you're doing right now is going to be the most valuable thing you can do tomorrow, and it's difficult to change that, you're going to be stuck doing whatever you're doing right now. And that means pumping out the oil, digging up the coal, whatever fossil fuel production process it is you're involved in, that's what you're going to carry on doing. And then of course, and the other one to throw in, I suppose, and it's a similar point, it's just that the vast scale of investment that's already gone into these things, that if you want your oil, if you want to get oil out of the North Sea, it's an incredibly expensive thing, difficult technical thing to put an oil rig there, to put the pipelines in place. Then once you've got the oil out, you have to refine it, which is incidentally where the real profit is being made. And then you have to deliver it to everyone. Now, that's an immense investment. If you have to turn around and say, actually, it's all now basically worthless because we can't burn all the fossil fuel reserves on the planet without basically incinerating all of us, or, runaway climate change, here we come. That's a terrible thing for company managers and company owners to contemplate, and they just won't want to do it. But it's what we're approaching. Like, the idea of unburnable carbon is quite a strong one, that there must be a limit, given what we know. The scientific modelling we have is really quite good in this. It's much better than the economic modelling, by the way. The scientific modelling is good. We have a rough idea about what the kind of limits might be to keep the Earth within we've gone well beyond 0 degrees average temperature rise. Don't forget that. It's now like hit and miss, and whether you get to sort of 1.5 or 2 degrees, and probably we're going to cross over that fairly rapidly. We know that the reserves of these, exactly as I say, fossil fuels that you can't burn, but we have a big social infrastructure that's geared up to getting out to them and burning as fast as possible. You see this happening now. I mean, the fact that the price of oil and gas has risen so much has given a real incentive to open up new fields and to try and burn this. The fact that the price of gas has shot up so much and there have been difficulties in supply connected to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in two different directions, sanctions one side and deliberate restrictions on the other, has led to a whole load of countries in Europe suddenly lurching into trying to burn coal again in their power plants. They're digging up coal and burning more of it because they're trying to get... So the perverse incentives against what society ought to be doing here are pretty dramatic. And the market alone will tend to push you towards, quite frequently, towards the worst possible outcome. And if it's not doing that, it's going to take you too slowly to a better one.
Thanks. So the Green New Deal involves, as we said, very big increases in state spending. Why is it wrong to say that we can't afford this? And why is there a tendency to say this? What are the ideas that inform this reaction?
There's a sort of basic point that John Maynard Keynes, the sort of greatest economist really of the 20th century, certainly the most famous, said that, look, if you can do it, you can afford it. Like, there is, in principle, if you can actually technically make something happen, then there isn't a reason why you can't make this happen, right? And if you start saying, oh, there's not enough money or whatever, that's not really the reason why you can't do it. Now, the real restraints in what you're doing this are likely to be, can you actually get the resources that you need to make this happen? Do you have enough people that you can employ insulating everyone's home in the entire country over the next 2 years or whatever? Can you train them up to do this? Can you have enough, it would have to be fairly small factories, one in each town or maybe a few, producing the insulation foam that can churn this out? Do you have enough chemicals going into those factories to produce the foam? These are all kind of physical supply problems. So if you really want to do something, and you see this demonstrated most dramatically in wartime, then you can pretty much make that happen. This has always been quite a powerful argument, or at least it's been used as an argument by people pushing the Green New Deal. Because you can say, look at the Second World War. You know, we had an aim, so you've got to defeat fascism in Europe. Everything gets geared towards that, and you just did it. And you don't really care how much it costs because you just have to do this. And you could treat the climate emergency something similar. Now, my concern with this is a couple of things, really. One is what we just touched on, that if we focus single-mindedly on just decarbonisation, we're going to ignore all these other costs that are appearing over here. The second one is that the sort of collaborative effort that needs to be made in this, I think, sometimes gets a bit ignored. It's very good if Britain is pushing towards trying to make this happen. I mean, fine. If you're trying to decarbonise rapidly, there's the issue of how you're going to pull everyone else along with you. What are your relationships with the rest of the world? What are your relationships with the people digging lithium through your batteries? And, you know, how are you going to reconcile this? So there's a question of economic justice that creeps in if you want to do this properly. In terms of Britain doing this, it is a rich country. There are a great deal of very wealthy people and institutions here. Ultimately, that wealth could be put into trying to make something like this happen. The challenge right now, I mean, to be blunt, is that for 10 years, it's been extremely cheap to borrow money, which is very, very easy, therefore, for government to go out and borrow at zero or lower interest rates and make this happen. We had 10 years where we could have done that. Those 10 years have now come to an end. So suddenly it's more expensive for government to borrow, so it's harder to do. So then you have to lean more heavily on taxes, I'd say, to make some of this stuff happen. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's just that you have to make the tax system, I think, work harder if you're talking like about a big country like Britain. If you were in a complete wartime situation, you could do it by, you know, as they did during the Second World War, you could just sort of insist that these things are done and find a way to make that happen. We're not in that situation. So it's, I think, a question now of taxes and economic justice that needs to be part of the consideration in making a decarbonisation programme happen.
You mentioned Keynes there, and at one point we were all Keynesians now, but we haven't all been Keynesians now for 40 years, 50 years, I don't know. Is ideology a part of the problem here? I mean, we talk about neoliberalism. Is there something in the kind of dominant neoliberal ideology, and maybe you could briefly explain what that means, that results in this aversion to state intervention and state
there is something to that. I mean, some of the early neoliberals were actually quite sort of environmentally inclined themselves. They just thought, you know, you can have a market that will solve ecological problems. The design of the European emission trading scheme was quite motivated by people who wanted a neoliberal solution to climate change. In other words, when we say neoliberal, what we're talking about really is the idea that everything ideally is going to be distributed by a market. And if you don't have a market, you need to set up something that looks like a market. So that's what the European emission trading scheme is, that you as a company, if you're emitting greenhouse gases, you have to pay for a license to emit each bit of that. And if you're not, you can get a credit for not doing this. And then you trade the credits. And then the theory is that the market of these credits for emissions or not doing emissions will be a completely efficient way to incentivize people who are emitting greenhouse gases to reduce them, and to have those people who are not doing greenhouse gases, not emitting them, given a real incentive to continue to act in a kind of climate friendly manner. And it hasn't worked, right? It hasn't really worked any way you tried it. Basically, you end up with the price of these credits is far too low to change company behavior, and you find that some companies just hoard these credits on a vast scale without really doing very much. The one that leaps to mind is actually outside of Europe is actually, some of its operations are inside, but it's Tesla. Tesla's made a huge sum of money from claiming its low carbon emissions, and therefore it can get the credits, and it sells the credits. Okay, fine, it's making at some point electric vehicles. That's something that's happening. But like, what's the real incentive for an electric vehicle manufacturer to do very much more than just take the money, right? It's not actually changing what ExxonMobil is doing very much, or some other European fossil fuel company. So that's a kind of ideological attempt to solve climate change, and it really doesn't work. I mean, what I think is quite interesting at the minute is that it's not just privatization that's the problem here, right? That you have some of the largest companies on the planet right now are state-owned. And they're often state-owned oil and gas companies. The China National Petroleum Company is one of the largest companies on the planet. Saudi Aramco is owned by Saudi Arabia. It's one of the largest, richest companies on the planet. The majority of the world's oil is in public hands. It's owned by governments, and they will exploit that to make money. so the challenges we got are actually worse, I think, than just the ideology of neoliberalism. That you can have countries that will see their oil as a source of income, of revenue, that otherwise potentially there isn't very much income or revenue. I mean, Saudi Arabia is busy in various weird ways trying to get out of just its dependency on oil, but there isn't that much else that's going to make money for at least a few people in Saudi society. So they have an incentive to do this, and they don't have an incentive to do it in a neoliberal privatized way. They've got an incentive to hold on to it. The country where I think that's a really interesting sort of dilemma. What might you do with these big publicly owned companies that are exploiting fossil fuel resources is Norway, of course, which is, we buy most of our gas that we import from Norway. They're a huge producer of gas and oil. Their state-owned company is now called Equinor. It's a very, very wealthy, it's a very wealthy country. It's a very wealthy oil and gas producer, and it's got loads and loads of reserves that it's continuing to exploit. So there's a real sort of argument about how Norway, nice, friendly, social democratic Norway, pulls out of being this big sort of fossil fuel producer as well. So it's kind of, neoliberalism's part of it. In a country like Britain where everything's been privatized, it's a major part of the problem here. The ideology of the Cameron government was we don't need government intervention because we don't care that much, and also we just don't believe in it. So it's a problem, but it's not the only problem, unfortunately, that we're up against.
Okay, that's interesting. So, I mean, what is in the context of somewhere like Norway? Mm-hmm. What is what needs to change for someone like Norway? Is it because Norway is a small country in a bigger world, or is it something else?
I mean, the issue there, the discussion that people have there is something like, okay, and Norway has the great advantage of, and Britain should have done this, but we had the Treasury and a Margaret Thatcher government, so we didn't. They've been taking an awful lot of the money from the oil and gas that have been producing and selling, and basically saving up. So this is the Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which I think is actually the largest single shareholding pot of shares anywhere on the planet right now. Something crazy like 1% or equivalent to 1% of all the world's shares are owned by the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. It's absolutely huge, and that's the money they've saved. And they have an argument, political argument, about what to do with this huge pot of wealth. On the state-owned oil company, the correct argument from activists, environmentalists, and some of the parties there is that, look, we're going to have to try and wind this down. It is not responsible for Norway to say, here we are, these great environmentalists, with our social democratic society, and aren't we doing well? But at the same time, you're just flogging stuff at vast expense currently to the rest of the world that's polluting the world, right? So you have to get out of this. But then you run into the argument, and this is one that you do see recurring in countries, especially where fossil fuel production is still a major part of the economy. I mean, Britain, because of deindustrialization, bluntly, is still quite a lot coming out of the North Sea, but it's employing nothing like the vast numbers that used to be involved in coal mining. We're not a major fossil fuel employer in that extent. But you do get a similar argument, which is, what are you going to say to the people employed in this industry? How are you going to replace particularly if you're working for Equinor or something, actually really quite well-paid, secure jobs? And what are you going to say to people who've been trained to do those well-paid, secure jobs? Now, what we've seen in the last few years is that with a bit of creativity, it is possible for government to say to people, you don't need to work in this place anymore. I mean, the furlough scheme in Britain was like that. It was, you don't need to go to work, we'll pay for you to, actually in this case, mostly sit at home. But you can have a government intervention that does something like this. It is possible to say, and rather than saying just go and sit at home, we'll pay 80% of your salary, you'd say, we will pay for you to be retrained. We will make sure that whatever job you go to instead is equivalent in terms and conditions to the one you used to have. Like, you're not going to get hurt by this process. Because we've seen, I mean, Britain's a good example of this. I mentioned coal mining. We've seen what happens when industries are rapidly closed down. And if you have a rapid decarbonisation programme, then that does mean potentially the quite rapid closure of industries like coal mining, which is still happening in Poland, still happening in Germany, really quite a big scale, that those things are going to have to be wound down, and potentially you have exactly the kind of devastation that you can imagine that we saw happening in mining communities in Britain in the 90s, especially at the end of the 80s into the 90s. So there has to be, I think, some recognition of some social costs from this. Now, not often, sometimes you see this used as an excuse. The GMB is a union in Britain whose general secretary I saw last week popping up to complain about bourgeois environmentalism. Right, this was just middle-class people complaining about the planet, whereas we were about workers, and workers want jobs, and it doesn't matter if it's fossil fuel industries, we want jobs. I think it's a lot of crap, to be honest, a lot of the time. But there has to be some sensitivity about how you deal with the social consequences of decarbonisation. Most versions of the Green New Deal have an awareness of this, and there's been hard work in the Appalachians, in places in America that are still coal producers, on trying to win those arguments about the need to get out of industries like this and into the sort of green industries of the future.
Thank you. So what do you think would be the best way to pay for a Green New Deal, to pay for the state expenditure that we need to see?
It's an interesting question. It's the bit that gets fiddly. If it had been even 3 years ago or 5 years ago, the answer in Britain and across much of the world would have been really, really obvious, which is you just go, taking account of inflation, which was much lower back then, government in Britain can borrow not only for free, it can borrow at a negative real rate of interest. In other words, the rate of interest the government faced on its own borrowing was so low that, in effect, people lending government money would be paying the government for the privilege of lending it money, which is a slightly weird concept, but that's how low interest rates for government were even 4 years ago, 3 years ago. And that would have been a very quick and easy thing to do, because it makes perfect sense. If you're a government and you say, we want to build this thing that's going to last a really long time, so we're going to build a tidal lagoon with a lifespan of 100 years at least, it makes perfect sense to say we will borrow to do this, and then the revenues we get from that tidal lagoon will pay the loan, and that's really not a problem. Even on a smaller scale, you can build a wind farm. Its lifespan is maybe 10, 20 years, something like this. It still makes sense to borrow. It's just like a business investing. If a business wants to grow, it'll go out and borrow some money from the bank, if it can get hold of that money, and use it to invest in growth. It will build a new factory, or it will buy some new equipment, or whatever it might be. This all makes sense. And if interest rates are really low, this is a no-brainer. There's really no reason not to do that. And it was a huge failure in Britain, in particular, that this didn't happen when the going was good. Interest rates are really shot up over the last year or so. That's likely to continue, and we probably won't have that very low interest rate environment that we used to have. So the borrowing route looks harder. Doesn't mean you can't do it or that you shouldn't do it. It just looks like a bit more effort than it used to for governments to make this happen. That, I think, is when you start to get into questions around, well, look, should we look at, for instance, taking some of the incredible profits that have been made over the last year by energy companies. The Treasury is now forecasting surplus profits over and above their average typical amount of money they make for energy companies in Britain of £170 billion. That to me sounds like enough money to get a decent Green New Deal going in Britain. That's enough money to really sort of kickstart things. So why not tax them? Or you look at the huge, extraordinary increase in inequality wealth and incredible profits that at least some people made during the pandemic. Oxfam's reporting the massive increase in number of billionaires in the last few years, the incredible profits that very large companies have made. I mean, this is something you go and you can take those profits. You could tap into it's now £955 billion that large companies have just sitting in their bank accounts in Britain, doing nothing. They're not investing. They're too scared to invest, basically, so they don't. You could take that money and start to spend it on this. But this is now a question, I think, of taxes more than of borrowing. Borrow some of it, but taxes is the other part.
Another, in terms of financing, another important plank in many Green New Deal proposals is reform of the finance industry and the setting up of public finance banks. Why is that important?
Well, this is how do you mobilise some of those resources? What you have at the minute is in two parts. That you have, particularly in Britain, really, you have financial institutions, and if people run a small business, they'll probably run into some version of this, that are really unwilling to invest in basically useful economic activity. Right, it's actually quite hard to get a loan if you're a smaller business in Britain to try and grow, and that's been the case for a while. And now that interest rates gone up, it's even harder. That really we have a financial system that wants to invest in property and other bits of the financial system. That's kind of how it makes its money. That's why you have house price bubbles, because people pile their cash. Financial institutions, not just the bank that you go to get your mortgage, but the way they take that mortgage and repackage and sell it on. Not quite as mad as it used to be before the crash, but still happens. So the financial system as a whole is really incentivized to do a whole load of things that aren't necessarily very useful for the rest of us. So you definitely want institutions new institutions with different incentives. So things like public banks or community-owned banks or regional banks, things that will operate in a different way with a different set of priorities. Can they get money into a whole load of the smaller scale projects that you might want to think about as part of your Green New Deal plan? I mean, that would be the kind of regional banking scale. So would there be locally owned generation of various sorts if you can do it efficiently? I mean, some versions of onshore wind would get you to that point, that kind of thing. I'm trying to think of other versions of decarbonisation you do on a local scale. Maybe financing for retrofitting. Maybe financing
district heating.
District heating is the other. Yeah, district heating is a very good, we don't have it all in this country, but you could start to do something like that. That kind of smaller scale intervention where you can have a regional bank with public incentive to try and deliver that. Financial system we have doesn't think like this. There are people around kind of really high finance that are trying to sort of push this. And I think sincerely, Mark Carney at the Bank of England, when he was governor of the Bank of England, started talking about some of this, and since then has been trying to set up a big initiative to get all the big financial houses of the world, all the major banks signed up to commit themselves to support, the zero carbon transition. And that's all nice on paper. What we found, if you saw the Financial Times report probably last week, was a bunch of those banks are now getting a bit, financial institutions, also pension funds, asset managers, all kinds of people in there. They're getting a bit shirty because having signed the commitment, because it looks nice and is kind of greenwashing for them, it now implies that they actually have to do some of this. And their own shareholders and owners are getting quite shirty because this will actually cost them money. And they think they can make more money by not doing this rapid transition. So again, it's this issue of incentives that they'll sign a bit of paper saying, yeah, we all commit to net zero. When it comes to actually delivering on that, suddenly it's all about the profits they're already making doing other things. They don't want to do it. So there's a need for, again, this isn't going to happen because of voluntary action by financial institutions. Private financial institutions aren't going to act like this. You're going to have something that pushes them. That's going to have to be government.
What kind of policies could a government adopt to ensure that private banks stop putting their money into housing bubbles and start putting it into the productive economy?
I mean, one obvious one there, well, it's obvious, I mean, is for the Bank of England, which supports those private banks. The reason you have a Bank of England, you reason have a central bank is that it's supposed to be a guarantee of financial stability for the rest of the system. This is why we've developed central banking over many hundreds of years as a way for that to happen. You have all these other banks that we get our money from in the middle of the system, trying to prop the whole thing up, intervening when it looks like there's some chaos taking place or a bank's going to fail, is a central bank. We actually saw this last week. People will have seen the £65 billion that the Bank of England has lined up to basically support pension funds that are on the verge of insolvency. That's from Monday last week. That's the function of the Bank of England, acting as a guarantee of financial stability for the rest of the system. That's quite powerful. That means that you can do things like telling other banks that, okay, look, if you're going to lend money for green projects that are clearly about reducing carbon emissions, you, in turn, can have a lower rate of interest on the reserves you have to place with us for your security. So we'll make it cheaper and easier for you to borrow money from us to go and make that happen. Us as the central bank, we make it easy for you as a private bank to do this, cheaper to do this. The People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, has been doing this for some time. So saying that where you have a green project, we will make it cheaper for you to get the money as a private bank to go and finance that green project. We'll make it, we'll give you this financial incentive. It's kind of something that governments can do, or at least central banks could think about doing as this kind of financial intervention. It's not being done in this country. We always have a view that every activity that there exists should all get the same interest rate, and the Bank of England should treat everything the same. And the result is everybody's incentivized to pile into property and other not particularly helpful things and not invest in actual useful productive activity.
So we're running a bit short of time, so I'm going to cut to the chase a bit on a couple of questions. So Keir Starmer has been coming out with some nice sounding green promises in the last week or so. To what extent do you think they map onto the kind of Green New Deal you're talking about, or do you think there's something missing in Labour's approach, or is it not quite clear yet whether this will meet what we need?
Well, on the face of it, it's good. I mean, the announcement that was in Keir Starmer's speech last week on creating a GB Energy, they called it, this publicly owned energy generator, which is going to concentrate on zero energy emissions, I think is an important part of the whole picture. It's a useful bit of the whole puzzle to get hold of something like this, not have, as we have somewhat ludicrously in Britain, this completely basically privatized provision. I say privatized, obviously there are state-owned generators operating in Britain. EDF is owned mostly by the French government and increasingly by the French government. Vattenfall is owned by the Swedish government. Big owns, I think, the majority of wind power in the country is a Swedish public company. So we will have something like this in Britain that will be used to push through the delivery of low carbon energy for the whole country. And because it's publicly owned, we'll get the profits back from that. We collectively will get the profits back from this. That's a useful part of the picture. The target of decarbonising the energy system by 2030, I think is very ambitious, actually. I think that's a real, quite a stretch to get there. Not implausible, but it's a stretch to get there, and it will imply lots and lots of investment. The National Wealth Fund that they were talking about setting up, it's not, it's a good idea. It's a very good idea to say, if we're investing in all this green technology, the public should get a share in that. And you can see it being something like Norway did 20, 30 years ago with their sovereign wealth fund, that if there's this new technology, a new resource that we're using, everybody gets a share in this. Okay, in 20, 30 years' time, this is going to be quite a substantial fund. This is going to be a really useful pot for us to pay pensions out of, which is what the Norwegians do with theirs. All of this is good. The problem is that all of it is not really going far enough or fast enough. The National Wealth Fund, they're talking about initially £8 billion. I mean, it's not nothing. It's good to get going, but it's not big enough to be transformative in the way that people are talking about. The publicly owned energy system is going to be, energy company is going to be one company amongst the entire system that's otherwise privatized. Now, it's good, and over time it should squeeze out, frankly, the private operators, but it leaves the rest of the system in private hands. And the incentives that this implies, and potentially the rather expensive energy that we have to put up with on the other side of it. There's also proposals to decarbonise, to do energy efficiency measures in homes. Again, probably not. It isn't on the scale that you'd want, or that it would make that really rapid rush towards decarbonisation. That's for Britain actually relatively easier than other countries. Like, we've already decarbonised quite a bit simply by closing down most of the industry here. Some of that we've exported abroad by saying China makes stuff instead. Not all of it, actually. So things have improved somewhat over the last few years. It's just not improved very much. And there are some easy wins around energy efficiency and decarbonising electricity generation that we could get to. But we're not going to get to them with just the private sector. That isn't going to happen. And we're not going to get to them quickly enough if it's just the Labour proposals are saying we'll do these small things. It's a good start, but I think the demand has to go further than this.
Okay, so we fit in a couple more questions and then open it up to Q&A. The idea for a just transition is very important to a Green New Deal. And I mean, we talked earlier about workers in fossil fuel industries whose jobs are on the line. I think people talk about a jobs guarantee for those workers to make sure that they can get retrained and moved into new jobs, perhaps in renewable industries, because they would have transferable skills. Yep. But I mean, the idea of a just transition also projects onto the international stage, where we talk about the relations between countries, doesn't it? I mean, one thing I didn't like about Keir Starmer's speech was very much the nationalist framework, where he was talking about a race to get to net zero first. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, is there a worry that this element of a just transition is likely to be missed out in a Green New Deal that is put together by a fairly orthodox, middle of the road party like Keir Starmer's Labour or Boris Johnson's Tories or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. I think the international dimension is what disappears, because it's like, okay, we're going to decarbonise our energy system very rapidly. Exactly as I said, that's a big resource demand on the rest of the world. Like, we don't have the lithium here to make the batteries that a decarbonised electricity generation system would require. You need the backup batteries because wind is intermittent, solar is intermittent, so you need to install other elements into this. So you have to go somewhere else to get that. And then, okay, so on what conditions are you acquiring these things? Are there going to be good terms and conditions for the miners digging the lithium out of the ground, for instance? Who is going to make the profits from that stuff being mined and delivered over here, even if it's then installed by a publicly owned energy company? What are we doing about procurement effectively from the rest of the world to make that happen? So those questions, I think, are very much not really part of the mix, and I think it's useful to raise them. The other bit is exactly to say the just transition. Again, for Britain, this is easier. than for other countries, simply because we don't have big heavy industry, which is a really big sort of carbon things you have to change down the line. We still have some steel producers, and there are things you need to work around that. I mean, we will need a great deal of steel. If you want to decarbonize rapidly, you're going to have to produce a huge amount of steel, because you're going to have to build those wind turbines, and it's the big win for Britain here. So there's less of a problem here, but still a problem. I wrote a report with Possible, the sort of campaigning think tank, last summer, on what a just transition might look like for the aviation industry, which is one of the really, really difficult bits of the economy to decarbonize. That to get a plane to take off, it's just very, very energy intensive, and therefore very fuel intensive. And therefore, as people on the call know, you end up with aviation accounting for an extraordinary amount of the world's pollution. Now, you can, down the line, you can see sort of green aviation fuels arriving. There is a lot of work being put in to try and find ways to generate aviation fuel effectively from hydrogen, from water. You electrolyze it. You can find ways to getting there. None of it is commercially available yet. Probably isn't going to be commercially available until 2030 at least, more like 2040, maybe 2050. So that can cover some of it. But otherwise, you're having to think of ways in which all these people used to be pilots, for instance. How do you retrain them to be train drivers? That we're just going to have to reduce the number of flights we take. We're going to have more trains running, both here and internationally. How are you going to get those people to retrain? What about all the people who work around airports? I mean, Heathrow's total employment is something like 60,000. A just transition has to be a plan. Not just saying to people, we will pay you and it's all be fine. It has to be a plan for, like, what are these people going to do instead over the 3, 4, 5 years it will take to sort of wind things down like this. Once you go through it, you can start to see how this becomes possible. You can change the jobs people do. There are things that are transferable skills, not perfectly. I mean, actually, pilot's one that's really on the hardest to sort of shift elsewhere. But there are lots of other things people can do. That's just for aviation. You need a similar plan for other parts of the economy. Car manufacturing, I think, is something similar. It's easier because it's relatively easy. That's why car manufacturers are doing it, to switch into electric vehicle production. But we also want to switch that into public transport electric vehicle production. So there's, in each part of the economy, you're going to want a just transition plan for, like, how you get there in a way that doesn't hurt the people doing the job, doing the jobs they're doing right now.
Okay, thanks. So just one last question. I was hoping to ask about degrowth and things like that, but I don't think we'll open that up now because we're getting a bit late. Britain's true role in the world. I mean, the people who want to delay climate action often tell us that Britain is only 1% of global emissions, and it's not that important. That's territorial emissions within the UK territorial boundaries. But there was a report out last year saying that actually, if you look at the finance industry, it's considerably more than that. And so that came to 1.8%, but that was also leaving out the insurance industry, which is based in London, and is very big. And it was also I presume it was leaving out, investments offshore in the kind of system of tax havens set up around the city of London in these kind of former colonial, these islands that used to be colonies of the UK or still are. And there's just massive amounts of money go through there, which we don't really know what it's doing. So, I mean, would you say that Britain's role in the world and potentially therefore our influence is much bigger than that 1% or even that 1.8% would suggest?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you don't want to. There is a need, particularly looking at the last week, and there is a need for Britain to be a bit more sort of humble about what it can actually do in the world. This isn't some place that's a mighty world-conquering empire. It never should have been, but it certainly isn't anymore. So there's a need for a degree of humility about what can be achieved here. But one of the things that is a win that you can see the society and country and economy we now have getting to quite easily compared to other places is zero carbon, at least in energy systems, and ideally beyond that point. And the demonstration effect that a large developed economy like Britain can actually do this, I think, is quite a powerful one. That's a useful signal to send to everyone else. The sort of Keir Starmer version of this is, oh, well, having invented all these technologies, we'll be able to sell them to everyone else. I mean, okay, fine. I mean, I'm happy to see that done. I mean, it'd also be nice to see intellectual property transferred to the rest of the world for free. If you invented something marvelous that's hugely energy reducing or decarbonizing, then fine, let the rest of the world have it for free. This is something we ought to be thinking about as the byproducts of a rapid decarbonisation program. that's part of it. The bit you touch on that's quite an interesting one is, what do you do about the vast amounts of wealth that is sitting in things that are quite close to British jurisdiction, or actually are British jurisdiction, which is tax havens. Now, there are international moves that British governments have notionally signed up to start to wind down tax havens globally. This is a turn that's been happening, driven by the OECD and particularly the US government over the last few years, and it is in train. It's not like this means therefore no tax havens. It's like squeezing a balloon. You squeeze one bit and it's likely to blow up somewhere else. But there is a degree of control that Britain could exercise over the operations of these places, these financial systems that are under British jurisdiction in various forms. And some of that could include, are you going to make zero carbon or better investments as part of what you're doing? That I think is a useful lever to think about. I'm not seeing many actual proposals around that as yet. I mean, there's some, I'm trying to think, there's some that have done the rounds on how to make tax havens behave better and have proper reporting standards. Throwing into this, can you report on your kind of climate balance sheet as well as your actual profit and loss and assets and liabilities balance sheet? Might be something to think about there.
Okay, thank you, James. I think maybe I'll finish my questions there then, Janet. So if you could stop recording, then maybe we can have a bit of a Q&A